Hi, welcome to CanadianBankReformers.ca. My name is Richard Garner, and today I'm joined by the Honourable Paul Hellyer to discuss CETA and other relevant economic issues as it pertains not only to our viewers here in Canada, but around the world. But first, let's tell the people a little bit about your career here in Canada as one of the most esteemed politicians in Canadian history.
Well, thank you very much. I was elected at the tender age of 25. Becoming at that time the youngest member of Parliament. And the reason I went into politics was because I was concerned about banking and financial systems which resulted in recessions and depressions, because I was a child of the Depression, and I was resolved that if possible we would never have another one. And so when the economics gurus were saying in the late 40s that we were going to have another depression in 1950, I said, I've got to try and do something about this. So I ran, and much to the amazement of everyone, except myself, who didn't understand what was involved, I won. And then, of course, the depression, which they had been calling for, didn't happen because the Korean War broke out. And governments can print more money to finance wars than they will to finance the peace. And so it was many years before we really got back to the point where the monetary system was such a live issue.
Well, and interestingly, probably not a coincidence, but we could probably talk about that on another video. But the 50s end up being an economic boon, actually, completely the opposite, at least in the US and partly in Canada. So as you, a young, early politician in your career, when do you start to realize that, for lack of a better word, the system is rigged?
I guess when I was in the building business, which was in the 1950s, and the banks tried their very best to put me into bankruptcy, but I managed to outsmart them and stayed in, built a lot of houses, very successfully ultimately, and that made the difference between being comfortable and poverty-stricken in my old age, and realizing that the banks, the system, tries to put just about every entrepreneur I've ever talked to out of business at some time in their career. And it's because they have too much power and because the ordinary people, in my opinion, don't have enough.
Which is obviously the perfect segue to Canadian Bank Reformers. Relatively new organization, but interestingly not new in terms of the impetus and motivation, because like you said, that's literally why you ran and was elected in 1949. So 68 years later, this issue that you were worried about then still not only hasn't been resolved, but arguably has become worse. So at this point in your not only political career, but personal life, you feel that this is so important that you're really dedicating, all your time and energy in your golden years to resolving this issue. Tell the people about Canadian Bank Reformers and why you feel it's so important.
Well, I feel it's essential because the young people of today, there are over 1 million of them unemployed in Canada, have been for 7 or 8 years or 9 since the system was deliberately crashed by Wall Street in 2007-8, and there's no relief in sight because the way things are developing, instead of solutions being offered, we're exacerbating a bad situation by following old practices, trying to borrow our way out of a debt crisis, which you can't do, and going down the wrong road. And so I just say to myself, my wife would say I'm driven, but I've been in this game for so long, and I wouldn't say have so much invested in it, but so much of my effort has been put into it, and so far without success, except very modest, that I have to do what I can. May not succeed, but I have to bow out eventually, saying, well, I've done everything I could. I've worked as hard as I could, and harder than most people, certainly at my age. Trans-Canada touring, speaking tour, coast to coast, doing things all the time, trying to find new ways, new avenues of getting through to the government and getting something going there. And so it's just, it's a lifetime challenge, really, of saying there is a better way. I know there's a better way. And it's relatively, it's not simple, but it's relatively simple. It's something that almost anybody can understand. And so why aren't we doing it? And the answer is, A, there's not the political will, first of all, and B, there isn't sufficient interest in learning on the part of the politicians.
But two things that Canadian Bank Reformers is obviously designed to address. One being awareness, education, helping people understand issues that aren't always, at first glance easy to understand, but also, as you know, being a politician, if there's enough of a groundswell of people who want something, who demand something, the very survival instinct of politicians who want to stay in power is to respond. The only reason that they haven't been forced to is there just hasn't been that groundswell of understanding, which brings us to CETA, which is an interesting example of another acronym out there in a world of acronyms that people are essentially acronym desensitized now. Right. Probably took people about 20 years to understand what NAFTA was, right. Really, and probably, we're sort of reacquainted to it during the most recent election with Donald Trump saying, it was such a terrible trade deal.
Worst one ever.
As he said, I don't know if he's going to rip it up though, but that's a conversation for another day. Right. But CETA, again, totally under the radar, with the exception of those 11th hour back and forths, give people a bit of an understanding first of what it is and why you're so concerned about it that you feel it's important to get this on the radar.
Yes, well, I think it's important to realize that, first of all, this is a part of a succession. We started with the Canada-US trade agreement. It was not a trade agreement. It was an investment agreement. The Americans wanted access to our resources and our corporations, and so they put together this pact and called it a trade agreement, free trade agreement. Mm-hmm. Wrong name, right from the beginning. And also, it provided a new concept, which should have been rejected out of hand. And that is giving American citizens greater rights in Canada than Canadian citizens. It's wrong, wrong, wrong. But for some reason, I guess the government was so anxious to get a deal that they went along with it. And along comes NAFTA, exacerbates the situation, and jobs start flowing south, some to the States, but more to Mexico, especially in the auto industry, where we had the auto pact that really worked for us until NAFTA came along. And the middle class starts to be decimated because the manufacturing jobs are moving out and they're being replaced with working for McDonald's or Second Cup or Starbucks or whatever, and maybe having 2 or 3 jobs to try and keep the family alive, And
well, and quickly, wasn't that always the ultimate byproduct of globalization? I know that when that term started floating around initially, especially probably people who viewed themselves as more to the left, for instance, felt like that was a progressive term that was about, we are the world, we're all coming together. This is a good sign to move forward without, trade barriers and all this. But in essence, what it provided was the sort of beginning of the end for, higher paying manufacturing jobs in the Western world. Give people a little bit of an understanding, because that's super relevant as it pertains to all these trade agreements that seem initially like they're great ideas, and CETA is kind of the same, I guess.
Yes, but these agreements were never basically trade agreements. They were agreements designed to transfer power from governments to transnational corporations and international banks. That's what they were. And that's
sold as trade agreements. Sounds like trade agreements, but ultimately, like you said, there's a Trojan horse thing going on.
Exactly, exactly. And it's been getting worse with each step. So 1 was, bad.
Yeah.
2 is very bad. 3, if you're talking about CETA, absolutely impossible, because it is the tipping point as far as Canada's future is concerned. And
why so dire with CETA?
Why so dire? Because for the first time, the financial parts of our Constitution are subject to CETA. Both federal financial operations and provincial financial operations are subject to CETA rules. In effect, it is a unilateral change in the Constitution of Canada, which gives to the federal parliament, not the government, the parliament, an exclusive, absolute right over money and banking. So we can do anything we want. Parliament can create money. It can have the Bank of Canada create money. It can do anything it wants. It can create banks, give them powers, take the powers away, amend them. They're licensees. They have that power. CETA is going to change all of that. And the most important change, as far as I'm concerned, is that it makes the use of the Bank of Canada as a provider of low-cost, or as I'm talking about now, debt-free money for the use by Canadians at all levels. Impossible, virtually impossible, because of the disputes decision mechanism. If we started putting into effect the policy, the main plank of the Canadian bank reformers, which is a social contract between the government and people of Canada, which in blunt terms is a term for using the Bank of Canada to create $150 billion a year for 7 years, split 50-50 between the federal and provincial governments, to get us out of the slump, to get people back to work, to get the economy rolling, and then starting replacing the infrastructure, repairing the old, replacing and building the new, that all of that would be subject to effective veto by European banks, the big European banks, who could sue us for tens or hundreds of billions of dollars if we did it. In other words, it's game over.
And this is not inconsistent with some of, like, for instance, with the TPP and other deals, where the ability for the country to be sued, for instance, because if they get in the way of specific deals through corporations, and they're and basically threaten the ability for the shareholders to maximize those deals. Countries are now having to give up their sovereignty essentially within these deals to be able to ultimately sign CETA or NAFTA or something like that. Talk a little bit about that and how much Canada has been sued, probably much to the surprise of anybody watching, and become the most sued country in the world.
Well, I can't answer that question. The most sued country under NAFTA so far. And hypothetical, who knows what would happen, but certainly if we tried to use the Bank of Canada intelligently for a change after 45-year interregnum, it would happen that the wealthiest people in the world, the most powerful people in the world, would say, thanks but no thanks. You're going to continue to borrow from us. Thought just went through my head. A little bit like the United States provinces who started creating their own money. And some big London banks said, no, no, King, please change the rules.
I think something happened there.
Ah, something did happen.
Something revolutionary.
That's the right word. There was a revolution. And interestingly enough, as I understand it, because the UK debt has not been lower since the revolution than it was at that time, people of the United Kingdom are still paying interest on the money they borrowed from their banks to fight the Revolutionary War.
It's a couple hundred years overdue, I would say.
I would say, absolutely.
So, well, you're doing whatever you can to spark your own revolution with Canadian bank reformers, but specifically, you're proposing a solution through legal means to stop CETA. Give us an idea of exactly what that is.
Well, we've tried the political route. We have asked people to write and say, social contract, yes, CETA, no. A lot have. We don't know how many. I would say, maybe, well, maybe 1,000, maybe 2,000, maybe more. But the government is paying no attention whatsoever. They're just going on as if nothing was happening. So some of us, I in particular, anticipated, knowing politicians, that they don't listen to people. They're the last people they listen to. They listen to the lobbyists,
Sure.
and the people who gave them money during the last election, and the people who provided them with organization and that sort of thing. That's the way the system works. And they were going down the route that was recommended by that group, who were all in the top 1%.
And probably helped write CETA.
They helped write it with some of the best lawyers in the world in order to make it so airtight that you can't wiggle out of it.
Yeah.
And here we are with an agreement that is really opposed by farmers of Canada, by the trade unions of Canada, by some of the organizations for architects and doctors and other professional people, and for many, many others who understand what's going on. And the government just gives the back of the hand to all of those people and says, well, we're plowing ahead anyway because it's in the cards, and that's the way the world is working. And you've got a bunch of globalizers in the federal system, the advisors of the government, so they're going. So I had anticipated that they wouldn't listen to us, and got in touch with Rocco Galati, who was one of the best constitutional lawyers in the country. Said, Rocco, we're going to have to try and get an injunction to prevent them from doing what they're going to do. And I would say to prevent the Prime Minister from making the biggest mistake of his life before he really mellow, and to give him a second chance, as it were, to do right by the people. And so he's been looking into it, and as soon as it was obvious, because the Prime Minister said, I'm going to fly to Europe on the 27th of October, I think it was originally, to sign this agreement. And we said, bingo, we've got to move.
Hence the CETA constitutional challenge. So what are the steps in that, and how can people get behind it?
Well, the steps was that he had to file
an injunction?
Well, he's seeking an injunction.
Okay.
He had to file a request with the court to prevent the ratification or implementation of CETA. And that was stage one. Well, then the federal side, the lawyer for the federal side, has already sent him a letter saying that they're going to ask for a stay, which is another way of saying to dismiss the case. If that happens, I hope it won't, but if it does, then we will appeal to the Federal Court of Appeal. And if we win that, as we should, then the government would appeal, and if we lose, then we'll appeal. But it will ultimately wind up in the Supreme Court of Canada. And the Supreme Court of Canada will have to decide whether the proposal of the government to adopt CETA is ultra vires of their powers, or whether it isn't.
And ultimately unconstitutional.
Unconstitutional, as well as immoral.
So it's funny because it would probably take getting it to the Supreme Court to get any coverage of what you're doing in the mainstream media, I'm guessing, right? Although we have seen coverage of CETA, you'd think this was arguably the best thing that happened to happen since sliced bread if you were watching and reading most of the mainstream media.
The controlled media, it's wonderful. We're in the big league. We've gone up the steps and we're now in the big league, CETA and then the TPP, and heaven's coming.
And even with TPP, which seemed to get a lot of pushback from a lot of different places, certainly was pretty unpopular at the grassroots level for sure, but even beyond that, yet still almost nothing outside of some op-eds, but really essentially nothing about TPP and now CETA. And essentially I mean, do you view them as unconstitutional?
Yeah, both of them. Because they take powers away from the constitutional powers, away from Canadian governments, and transfer them to corporations and banks outside our country who don't care about us at all and they care only about themselves. And this was designed. This is not an accident. That's the way the whole plan was put together. And I've been following it for especially the last 11 years now, watching the developments, what's going on in the world, and the New World Order gang, as I call them, want to have an unelected government for most or all of the world, and they're doing it through the banking system, getting control of each country one after another to the point where they can't move, and also the trade agreements, which are transferring power away from the governments to the point where they have nothing left. And so they have accomplished what otherwise they would have to use armies to accomplish. And the pen is greater than the sword.
Well, they seem to figure out a long time ago. You mentioned the American Revolution earlier. And, you know, I guess it was a few years later the French followed, right? And it seemed whatever had been organized as a sort of a global system prior to that was all out in the open. This is always interesting to me that when you talk about these things today, people are like, oh, that's, you know, you're talking about conspiracies. It was only a couple hundred years ago that people were like, no, I'm fully aware that there's this small cabal of people running the world. They wear crowns and carry scepters and they're kings and queens and we're less than them. Yeah. That was understood. Yeah. And then after the American Revolution, the French Revolution, it started to seem to be on the other side that they were like, wow, this is kind of getting out of hand. And it's probably pretty expensive to, you know, do this in the way that we've been doing it. So, okay, it was kind of this acknowledged, you won your freedom, we're taking off the crowns, you know, you guys get to vote every 4 years and whatever. Meanwhile, they just moved into the background and realized it was infinitely easier to do what they were doing by doing it sort of behind the curtain.
Absolutely. The Wizard of Oz, behind the curtain. Just a little...
Not subtle, that, eh?
No, not subtle, no. No, just... And you know, CETA is sort of, I'd say, a clever takeover agreement. That's what it is. And all planned to work that way.
Pushed by Europe, pushed by Canada, or pushed by the cabal? Or...
Well, probably instigated at some stage by the cabal, and then pushed by Europe, and then pushed by Canada. At the end, we were the ones that were pushing for it, simply because I guess we had a new government that wanted to have some brownie points by the end of its first year of term of office, and said, hey, this star, this crown is CETA, and if we get that in, boy, we'll really have something to brag about. Yeah,
high profile, sort of international looking, got a lot of good coverage in Europe. Yeah. So I guess, yeah, it certainly helps the Trudeau brand, we could say that. But ultimately, how will it affect, I guess, sort of, you know, me and you at a tax level, you know, just generally as far as the sovereignty of this democracy?
Well, how it will affect us means that we will have another 10, 20, 30 or 40 or 50 years of mediocre growth, anemic growth really, that the recession will just keep on going indefinitely because we don't have the means to get debt-free money from our own bank to end it and to get the economy back up and rolling the way it was in the 50s and 60s.
But I've heard, you know, I've heard you talk about this before, and one of the things though that I'm a bit puzzled by is that it would seem it's not ignorance that we're talking about, though, right? I mean, because I don't think, I think a certain amount of people who are, you know, walking the halls of Parliament today are ignorant to what you're talking about.
I would say 99%.
But there's X amount percent that are clearly aware of why it is the way it is and don't want it to change. So how do we address that?
I'm not sure that that's so, because from my sample, there haven't really been many monetary reformers or people who even understood it in the House for some time. I guess 10 or 20 years ago there were 5. Back in the days when we were electing monetary reformers from Quebec and the Western Canada, there were a lot more.
Yeah.
But now there are virtually none.
Really?
And as a matter of fact, I couldn't name one in the House. And I think this is the first time in my life that I haven't been able to say, well, there's one person down there that I know that.
To be honest, I had never even heard the term of money reformers, as that there were groups of people that were always present at the governmentary level that were looking to reform monetary policy.
Well, sure, the social credit movement first of the West, and their means of doing it was different. They're calling it these days in other countries helicopter money. The social credit, we're going to send $5 checks to every Canadian to get money into circulation so that the economy would come up. Not an efficient way to do it, but at least was something. And they were spurned and reviled in some cases.
Ultimately marginalized, though, at the end.
Marginalized, and the press were, funny money, they called it.
Yeah.
Well, all money's funny, and what the banks make is the funniest of all. It's not really money at all. It's just their credit they're lending us and charging us dearly for it. So, yeah, and I don't know anybody down there now, not a single person that understands. And I have a letter that I just got in the mail from someone who wrote the Minister of Finance. And it is the same basic letter they've been sending out for 40 years, saying that, well, they can't use the Bank of Canada because it would be inflationary. That, my friend, well, let me think about a word. Balderdash?
Yeah, I was going to say. Family television here.
Right, family television. It's balderdash or baloney or whatever you want to call it, because it isn't true. We did it for 35 years. We did it for 35 years. It worked like a charm, and we didn't have any more inflation than the average of all the OECD countries. So it didn't.
From what years to what years did Canada?
From 1939 to 1974. The best 35 years of 100 years. And it worked like a charm. And so we know, I know because I lived through it, that it was good for the people.
What changed in '74 then?
The unilateral decision on the part of the Bank of Canada to stop looking after its shareholders and to take its orders from the Bank of International Settlements in Zurich, Switzerland.
Sounds like a cabal.
Well, you've got it, because it was the cabal that runs the Bank for International Settlements.
And for those people that don't know, that is essentially the central bank of the central banks, correct?
Right. It is. It's the central bank's bank. And
Not about a bad gig.
no, and it has a very questionable history too. It supported the Nazis before the war and during the war and after the war.
So obviously we want to talk about this, big picture as well as small picture, because unfortunately the truth of the matter is, as you know, people, don't really care / get involved unless it affects them personally. Well, the good news is then, I guess, you will all be affected personally in one way or another, essentially at every level of, the Canadian job market, for instance. Talk about some of the jobs that you think are probably going to be the most affected earliest.
I think the great thing about our plan is it's right across the board. It's not limited to infrastructure. It's not limited to any one of the real basic needs. It would be, and especially because it's divided 50-50 between the federal government and the provinces and territories on a per capita basis, and they put it into circulation, it would cover healthcare, education, the arts, the Aboriginal needs, and then the federal level also maybe a few dollars for defense so they can get some new planes within 50 years. And, and fix up some of their infrastructure too. and maybe pay down a little bit of their debt. But it goes right across the board because you have a lot of people involved with a lot of different ideas and a lot of different needs because the province's needs are not the same. And it would have an almost magical effect. And I would guess that we could reduce the unemployment in Canada by at least 50% within 2 years and get the growth rate up from the average of, peanuts that it's been to 4 or 5%, and keep it at that level, which is more than enough to provide for the new young people coming into the job market and taking care of the needs for pensions and so on for the older people as well.
And this is where you come in, I guess, because obviously, yes, you guys sort of have the pedigree and the wherewithal to mount something called the CETA constitutional legal challenge, but it's not cheap.
No.
And more, not just the sort of the financial resources part of this, but as we talked about before, and I guess a great example that recently happened with Standing Rock, when there is enough political risk for somebody, they will then pay attention, and only will they pay attention.
Right, exactly.
So as much as it's important to get involved by, helping financially, spreading the word, spreading these videos, spreading awareness about the website is also key, because we've seen some optimism and some encouraging signs from grassroots movements recently, and that's exactly what the Canadian reformers are, Canadian bank reformers are, as well as the...
We still need thousands and thousands more people to write to the Prime Minister and their member of Parliament and say, social contract, yes, CETA, no. If we got enough thousands of them, maybe the government would capitulate before we got to the Supreme Court. I don't know. But they're certainly not going to unless they get a wave, a tsunami of opposition from the people that causes them to think about their own political future and the risk that they're taking and going ahead when the people are saying no.
And this is not a let's worry about this next year or 2 years. No. The urgency is now, isn't it?
The urgency is now, immediately. And then, of course, we need financing. I don't know what the ultimate cost is going to be, but I would say that including some outside witnesses, which we'll have to bring in at some stage, that it would cost $150,000 or maybe a little more, and that's quite a bit of money.
Well, and I guess the ultimate goal, and I would use the example of sort of the Jim Garrison strategy with the case he did bring to trial around the JFK assassination was essentially not so much trying the people that were accused, but was really to put the entire conspiracy on trial and allow the people to sort of understand more about it and then make their own decision. In this particular case, I'm guessing, in a world where we're pretty sure that if you go out and ask 1,000 people on the street, what is CETA and what is it about, maybe one person or two people would even have heard of it or know what it is. So your goal, not only to challenge it in the courts, but use that opportunity to get at the coverage and educate people about exactly what they're getting into.
Exactly, yes.
And I mean, from that standpoint, if you were at a cocktail party and somebody asked you really quickly, why should I care and why should I get involved? What would you tell them?
Because your future's at stake.
And a lot of people say that politically, but in this particular case, you're talking not just about their financial future, you're talking about the sovereignty of a democracy.
The sovereignty of the country and the financial system, which are mingled totally, and the whole range of options of being able to make decisions about whether you're going to have fracking or not, and make decisions about all of the things that are important to people on your health standards, and whether you're going to continue to allow GMOs and whether they're good or whether they're bad and so on. All of these things you're putting on the line if you sign CETA, and you lose your right to govern for the sake of the people and what you think is their real best interest.
It kind of reminds me of the terms and conditions on websites that we get, and it's probably about 100 pages of legal jargon, and we just have the big thing agree, because obviously who's going to read it, right? And we're agreeing to stuff we have no idea about, and in this case I'm guessing...
I've seen the original pile of document from CETA. It was this high. There were, I think, 1,200 pages.
So impossible for anybody, including the politicians who are supporting it, to have even read it.
Absolutely. Amazingly, when they introduced the bill, it mysteriously or magically was reduced to 500 pages.
Oh, right.
So that Mr. Galati has to go back and read everything again to get the right paragraph numbers and so on. But they will not read it before it is signed, before they approve it, that's for sure. And even with the free trade agreement, the minister in charge boasted in his memoirs that he hadn't read it before it was signed.
That's democracy at work, people, right there. Before we let you go, I mean, it's interesting to me whenever we get together to just, you know, hear like 1949 was when you were elected. Like, I mean, it's rare to be able to have the privilege to, you know, be with somebody and exchange ideas and information and learn, who has been able to see, not read about, see so much history, see the cycles, the boom and the bust. So it's one thing to have theories. We could go on the internet and watch 1 million documentaries and come up with our own ideas as to, you know, why something is the way it is. But you've seen it firsthand over almost 6 decades as a politician.
All of the different cycles and different systems.
And here we sit here today. That young man who felt compelled to run at 25 years old, in a true act of public service, because that's literally what motivated you to run. Are you, as we sit here today, 68 years later, are you optimistic, or are you worried that you know, what you started 68 years ago is never going to see the finish line, or are you starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, I'm a congenital optimist, or I wouldn't get out of bed in the morning.
Agreed. Yeah.
So that's what keeps me going. I'm a realist, and that's the reason we launched the action, because you could be optimistic without the action, and you know what's going to happen. It's going to be bad. We launched the action because the realism and the optimism sort of came together and said, realistically, only the courts can save you. The government, the politicians will not save you. They will not save the country. They will not do the best thing for the people. Maybe the courts will. So we'll appeal to the courts, because that is our last resort, our last hope. Without it, we're dead ducks. So let's go for it.
So we will appeal to the courts, and we'll also appeal to you, CanadianBankReformers.ca. There's a link there on CETA if you want to stay up for a couple of weeks and read 1,200 pages or so to better understand what we're getting into and what you're getting into, but also a lot of information there, more videos, as well as links to how you can donate, how you can get involved, and how you can be part of a very important grassroots movement that isn't really just about the future. They're always about the future, but in this case, it's about the present. And so on behalf of everybody at CanadianBankReformers.ca, I'd like to thank the Honourable Paul Hellyer, not only for joining us today, but for doing what you've done by really dedicating your entire life to public service.
Thank you very much for your kind words, and thank you for coming.